and I love nothing more than a really good old-fashioned ghost story. So that's what I want to read to you today, a ghost story from this book here. It's called The Tales of Terror from the Black Ship by Chris Priestley. And in this book, this wee chap here, he's Ethan. He tells the story of himself and his sister Kathy. Now, Ethan and Kathy are stuck in an inn, high atop a cliff, and all around them is the sea, and there's a storm raging, and there's the waves crashing against the cliff, and Ethan and Kathy had fallen ill, so their father, with whom they live, had set off to fetch a doctor, so they're all alone. And so while the storm is going on around them, all of a sudden, there is a knock on the door. And when they open, this really scary looking sailor is standing on their doorstep. Now, Ethan and Kathy end up inviting him in, and Thackeray, that is the name of the sailor, he tells them these stories from his travels, ghost stories, scary stories. And when Thackeray leaves again and he goes out into the storm, Ethan and Kathy realize something, not just about Thackeray, but about themselves as well. So that's the story that I want to read to you, the last story in the book, and it is called Wolfsbane. Now I need my glasses. Kathy and I watched the black ship sail away, dissolving into a fog that had mysteriously built up on the horizon. So Thackeray had been telling the truth. He could not drown in the storm because he was already dead, already drowned most like, as he had no signs of injury. The cliffs held no fear for him. What had he to fear after all? We returned slowly to the inn, and once inside, the hypnotic strangeness of the moonlit bay, the ragged ship and its ragged crew, the storyteller and his fearful yarns, they all seemed to retreat from view, like a nightmare does to the waking dreamer who, when asked what it was that woke him so afraid, can recall only the fear itself and not the cause. And as this spectral world retreated, the real world and its concerns came flooding back, and with them the realization that our father had still not returned. I could see that Kathy was worried, and I put my arm around her shoulder to reassure her. We went back to the settles by the fire, where we had so recently been listening to Thackeray's Sea Tales. His empty glass still sat on the table. His strange aura clung to the place with such vivid persistence that we both found ourselves staring at the space he had vacated as if he might materialize in front of our very eyes. I shook my head, still troubled by his visit. Why had he been drawn to our inn? Why did he not go and haunt his childhood home, and where was that exactly? It struck me then that if Thackeray really was dead, we did not have any way of knowing how long ago his death occurred. His uniform was old-fashioned. That must be why we had not heard of any Thackeray's living nearby. Thackeray, his family, his sweetheart Kathy were all from the past. How distant, though, I did not know. But I needed to shake off the enchantment of Thackeray's visit, if such a thing were possible, to look to the present and address the all-too-real predicament we had so long been distracted from. The first faint gleaming of the new dawn would soon be appearing in the east, and I told Kathy that since we were fully recovered from whatever had ailed us, we would, at first light, if Father had still not returned, make our way down to the village. The storm had passed now, and whatever our father had said about staying where we were, we could hardly be expected to sit there and do nothing. I had wanted to believe that his act in racing out into the teeth of the storm to try to find help for his sick children was a turning point in our lives. He had gone away from us over the past years with his drinking and evil temper. And strangely, despite his physical absence, he felt closer to us now than he had for a long, long time. But I began to wonder if he had not simply deserted us. Kathy readily agreed with me that we should leave the inn at daybreak. Like me, she felt the need to do something. Thackeray's tales, however unsettling, had, with their odd intensity, fired our spirits and filled us both with a kind of crackling, nervous energy. Suddenly, there was someone at the door, rattling the handle. Assuming it to be father, we ran over, but quickly saw through the window that there were at least 2 men beyond. Cathy leapt to my side. Had the spectral storyteller returned? Had he brought some of his ghostly crewmates with him? No, it could not be. We had watched the black ship sail away. And yet, who could know what such spirits were capable of? He and his grim companions might have flown across the bay like crows or bats. I cannot recall a time I felt so afraid, or so unsure of what I knew, or trusted that I knew. For Thackeray was one thing, but the thought of a dozen of these dead but somehow living mariners entering the inn and occupying it with their tattered presence filled me with dread, and I could see that Cathy felt the same. We heard the sound of jangling keys. But before I could think about a plan of action, the door burst open, and I grabbed Cathy's hand and pulled her into an adjoining storeroom, out of sight, praying we had not been seen. Crouching with Cathy at my side, we could peer through the gap between the door and the jamb. 2 men had entered the inn, both young, in their 20s, both curiously dressed, wearing trousers as sailors do, though they were like no sailors I had ever seen. Their clothes were well made, but of a strange design, as were their hats, which were domes with a narrow brim. "We are taking something of a risk entering the place," said one of the men. "It has been liable to fall into the sea for many years." Cathy looked at me and shared my puzzled expression. Who were these men, and why did they not call out for assistance? They seemed to assume the inn was empty. "Do you know, I'm sure I felt the building move just then," he said. "It is an incredible place," said the other man. "But is it deserted, you say? It does not feel empty." Cathy nudged me, but I had already seen it. The man who spoke these words seemed to look straight at us as he did so, as if he knew we were there. "Well, I assure you it is," said the other. "Feel free to look around. We shan't be disturbed." They were robbers, I was suddenly certain of it. If they searched, they would surely find us, and I decided that it was time to make a move. Thackeray's insinuation that I was not as brave as he for staying here with my family had roused me into recklessness. I stood up and walked into the room to confront them. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" I said. "My father has just stepped out for a moment, but will deal with you on his—" "The locals shunned the place completely since the incident," continued the first man, ignoring me completely. "Ah, yes," said the other, "the incident. And it all happened in this very place, Hugh." "I must insist," I said loudly, stepping closer to them with fists clenched, angry beyond words that they should treat me with such utter disdain. Cathy had joined me now. "Yes," said the man called Hugh, "I thought it might amuse you to soak up the atmosphere. I know how fascinated you are by such things, Montague." "They can't hear us," said Cathy, "or see us." "And it was your father who found them," said the man called Montague. "Why can't they see us, Ethan?" said Cathy, frightened and puzzled in equal measure. "I don't know, Cathy," I said. "Yes," said Hugh, "and it drove him to an early grave, I always felt. He never forgave himself." "But from what you have told me, he had nothing to admonish himself about," said Montague. "Well, he always felt that he should have been able to tell that the father's drinking had gone beyond the realms of drunkenness and into madness. He was their doctor, after all." He had tears in his eyes now. "To poison your own children, Montague," said Hugh. "What kind of man would do a thing like that?" "A madman, Hugh," said Montague, "as you said." "Aye." "Make them stop, Ethan," said Cathy. "Please, make them stop." I stepped even closer to the man called Hugh and was about to poke him in the chest, when he turned suddenly and walked towards the settles where we had listened to Thackeray. He walked straight through me. "Ethan!" shouted Cathy, grabbing my arm. "What's happening?" But I did not know. "Are they ghosts?" "How did he do it?" said Montague. "The poison, you mean?" said Hugh. "It was aconite poisoning." "Aconite?" repeated Montague, as if he were making a mental note of every detail. "Yes," said Hugh. "It is a common enough plant, Aconitum napellus. You might know it as monkshood or wolfsbane." Wolfsbane? Oh, large spikes of dark blue flowers? That's the one, said Hugh. The flowers are pretty enough to be sure, if a little sombre, but the leaves and roots are deadly. Montague shook his head. Then I pictured my father manically digging up the flowers in the garden. They were blue. I had a fleeting memory of my mother calling them wolfsbane. I must have unwittingly built a wall against these recollections, but it was a wall of sand, and the tide was coming in. They say that the events of that night are played out whenever there is a storm, said Hugh. Like the one we've just had, said Montague, looking, I thought, at Cathy, though, of course, he could not see her. Yes, said Hugh, the father poisons the children all over again and leaves them to die while the wind howls around the house. I'm sure it's nonsense. Cathy and I stared at each other. I was overcome with a strange sense of knowing these things to be true, of knowing and of forgetting. Are you? Said Montague. You should try never to be sure of things. You say the strangest things, Montague, said Hugh with a smile. Come on, let's return to the land of the living. Very well, said Montague, appearing to look at me this time. And remind me what happened to the father. Oh, he confessed, said Hugh, spent the rest of his life in a lunatic asylum. Do you know what's really strange? He poisoned himself, said Montague. Yes, he did, said Hugh. How on earth would you guess a thing like that? He stole some wolfsbane from the cottage garden at the asylum. Would have thought that they'd have had more sense than to grow a poisonous plant in a place like that, wouldn't you? Yes, said Montague with a wry smile. It'd be awful if it were true. That the poor beggars, the son and daughter he murdered, if they really did have to go through the thing over and over again. Yes, it would, said Montague. I wonder how a spell like that might be broken, said Hugh. By knowledge, said Montague. Once they know the truth, they can rest in peace. Let us hope they find the truth then, said Hugh. I reached out and held Cathy's hand, and turned to see the tears in her eyes, tears that I shed likewise. But I thought of the Scrimshaw imp and the horror of being trapped in a grinding wheel of fate. The truth was better than that. I say, look at this, Hugh said. Montague walked over, and Cathy and I followed. Hugh was examining something on the counter and peering up at the ceiling, puzzled. What is it? Said Montague. Well, look, said Hugh. Look at these old coins here. They're soaking wet, but there is no leak in the ceiling. It was the money that Thackeray had left. And look here. Hugh walked over to the settles and the table we had so recently vacated. Do you see? The seat and floor here are soaking too. Look at these old books. Hugh picked up our copy of The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, and it fell apart at his touch. Leave them be, said Montague. We have imposed ourselves on these children long enough. These children, said Hugh, raising an eyebrow. Ah, the ghost children, I see. Jolly good. Yes, perhaps you're right, Montague. This place gives me the creeps. The men walked towards the door and opened it. The first inkling that dawn was about to rise was in the chill night air that entered. At the threshold, Montague turned and, tipping his hat, said quietly, Goodbye. Then the door was closed and we were alone once more. Cathy was the first to speak. I think we have waited for Father long enough, she said. She sounded older somehow. Yes, Cathy, I answered with a sigh. I think perhaps you're right. Shall we go up to sleep then? Yes, I said, turning to her with a smile. And so we walked upstairs, hand in hand, the gauze that had once covered our eyes now lifted, and we could see the stars through the holes in the roof above our heads, and an owl hooted loudly from the chimney. We stood together and looked out across the bay, and there in the distance was an inky presence all black, like the shadow of a ship, and a light winked once from its stern. Goodbye, Thackeray, said Cathy. Aye, I said. Goodbye, one and all. Cathy lay down on her bed. Do you want one last story? I asked her. No, she said. No more stories. I feel so very tired all of a sudden. And I felt that tiredness too. It was like the heavy-limbed weariness after a hard day's toil. Sleep seemed like a friend to me now, and I was happy to close my eyes and let myself sink into its dark, unfathomable depths. Merry Christmas. Bye.